All right, everybody, welcome to week 4. This week we're going to get more into CSS, or cascading style sheets. And we've already worked a little bit with CSS this semester, so this is going to be the more formal introduction to the style language and to the formatting and kind of to more in depth on how everything works. And we're going to kick that off first by talking about the box model. And the box model is kind of the fundamental behavior between CSS and HTML. And what I mean by that is if we have a paragraph in our HTML with the word box in it, we'll close that. This forms, so if we were then looking at our browser, it would just look like that, right? So it would be a really simple text box. But what we can't see in the HTML is the imaginary box that surrounds this text. And we've already kind of talked a little bit about this when we talk about block level elements. So we know paragraphs are block level elements, so they're going to block off the entire section of the browser window. And you guys have probably noticed this as you've been working through some of your projects in the last few weeks, that as you add paragraphs and as you add a significant amount of text to that paragraph, it stretches across the entire browser. And as you resize your browser, or as you look at it at different screen resolutions, you can see that the text kind of expands and contracts into the width of the browser. And that's because that paragraph is living inside of this box. So this is actually content. We'll call this part of the box content, because that's what's in here. That's our content. So in the CSS box model, we have different layers then around this box. So the next thing we have around this box is what's called padding. And now we're getting into the CSS, and we're also getting into some of our CSS rules, but this is going to affect how your CSS displays, or excuse me, how your HTML elements display on the page. So this border is called your padding. So this is another box that surrounds this content. So if we were to go into CSS and add 5 pixels of padding around our paragraph, that 5 pixels would be this area right here, all the way around. So let's just say that that padding is 5 pixels on every side. And just for the sake of argument, let's say that our box content is 100 pixels wide. Okay, so now the next part of our box is the border. So if we draw another box, and we're gonna overlap our padding here, but that was kind of a poor label choice. Okay, but you get the idea. So now this is our border. So let's just crosshatch this a little bit so we know. So now this is, again, another CSS property, another part of the HTML that we can style, and that's a border. So we can add some type of border using CSS, and we'll get into all these different properties in a little bit, but for now I just want to talk about what this is doing to the outside. So now if we were to add in CSS, say we want to put a border around the outside of our box, and say we want to have another 5 pixel border. So if we did that, if we added that CSS rule, or that CSS property, and we added another 5 pixel border, oops, I keep messing that up, 5 pixel border. Okay, so now you can see what I'm talking about when I talk about the box model. This is the order and the location of where CSS will place particular elements or particular properties of an HTML element on the page. So let's recap where we are to this point. We've created a paragraph with the word box in it, and that creates this box content across the page. Now, just for the sake of argument, I've said this box is 100 pixels wide, but without any additional CSS, this box is going to be as wide as your browser currently is. So you could resize your browser down to 100 or whatever, but you get the idea there. So the second thing I've done is added some padding around this box. And that padding is right here, forms around the outside of that box, and it is 5 pixels large. Now, one thing to notice is that when I add padding and border to a element, that border is going to be on the outside of the padding. So say this entire box content was filled with a paragraph. If I added 5 pixel padding and then a 1 pixel border, there would be 5 pixels of padding between the border and the content. So that order is important when you're looking at your CSS file and you're thinking to yourself, okay, how do I style this box? Or pretend this is an image maybe and you want to add some nice bordering and padding around it. How am I going to order those and place them in the right areas so that our finished result looks right? So there's one more box around these 3 boxes to complete our box model, and that is margin. And margin is a lot like padding, except it's applied on the very outside of our box. So this is margin. All right, and let's just say that this is also 5 pixels. Ooh, almost wrote that wrong again. Okay, so this is our complete box model. We've got a margin, we've got a border, we've got a padding, and we have our content. All of these things together make up the entire width of a particular element on the page. So let's write out the CSS of what this might look like. So we would have a P element, and we'd be opening up a bracket, and then so our box width would be 100 pixels, and we're going to specify it in this example just because it's easier. So then we have a 5 pixel padding, okay, 5 pixels. And usually in these padding and margin calls, you can or in these rules, you can say, in these selectors, you can say 5 pixels top, 5 pixels top right, bottom left. So you could actually have 4 values here. But if you just put 1, it will apply this padding evenly around the box. So that's what we want. So now we also had a border here. So let's go border. And that is going to be 5 pixels. Now the border selector, or the border, the border rule has an additional parameter of solid. So this is the type of border. This could be dashed or dotted, and then a color. So in this rule, we'll just say black. And then finally, we have our margin on the very outside. And that's, again, 5 pixels. And then don't forget to close the rule. And so like our padding rule up here, we can give it 1 value, which it will apply evenly around the box. So this is what the CSS looks like to give us this box right here. So even though you've specified a width of 100 pixels here, if you want to get the total width of this box, you need to add all of these together. So really what we're talking about here is total width is going to be 100 plus we've got 5 pixels of padding on each side, 10, plus a 5 pixel border on each side, 10, plus 5 pixels of margin on each side. So that gives us 130 pixels of total width on the page. So this is important because when we get into talking about layouts a little bit later on, you're going to need to know exactly how much horizontal and vertical space your site and elements on your site are taking up. So it's going to be important to know how to calculate this properly and to know that when you're adding a margin, a border, or a padding on a fixed width element, that's going to affect your overall width. So this is very important. The box model is kind of the fundamental rule of CSS, and it's kind of where everything starts. And the funny thing is it's also where the very first CSS bug is going to be introduced. So CSS isn't really buggy per se, but it has a lot of quirks. And the problem is not CSS itself. The problem is browser vendors. So each browser vendor looks at the CSS specification and kind of interprets it in their own way. So the one culprit in the CSS box model is our buddy Internet Explorer. And I'm going to try to keep my Internet Explorer rants to a minimum this semester, but we want to avoid Internet Explorer as much as possible. And now I don't want to go on an anti-Microsoft rant or an anti-Internet Explorer rant, but in terms of just making things easy for right now, you want to stick with, in my opinion, WebKit browsers or Firefox, and stay away from Internet Explorer. IE9 is actually okay, and I've had some pretty good experience with IE9. IE8 and below are going to be problematic. Typically, professionally, at least right now, you need to be designing for IE7 plus, and I would even argue that you could be designing for IE8 plus. IE7 is going to give you loads of problems, including the box model problem. So just so that I don't go on a huge tangent with Internet Explorer, if you have IE9, you should be okay, but I would still encourage you to download Firefox or Chrome. IE8, you're treading on funky territory there. IE7 and below is just going to give you problems. If you're still using IE6, you need to upgrade your computer or find a new profession, one or the other. So the problem with Internet Explorer is that if you do not declare a doc type in your header, so if you just like start writing HTML with no real doc type and you add some CSS, Internet Explorer will not calculate the box model this way. Internet Explorer will assume that this is your absolute width, and then it'll start subtracting inward from these margins. So it actually does the opposite of what it's supposed to do, and it's bad, bad, bad. We do not want the box model being interpreted that way. Because think about browser compatibility. Think about trying to design a website that looks good in all the browsers when you have one browser completely misinterpreting your width, padding, border, and margin requirements. It would be a nightmare, and it is a nightmare. So to make sure that IE8 and above does not go into that funky quirks mode that does not calculate the box model correctly, you always need to make sure you have a proper doc type in the head of your HTML file. And we discussed that earlier on in the semester. So just make sure you're using proper HTML, really, and you shouldn't run into this issue. But if you are having problems with this, that should be the first thing to check. Make sure you have a proper doc type and make sure that you're not in some funky Internet Explorer mode that is causing your box model to be calculated incorrectly. Okay, so this is the box model. This is our intro to CSS, and we're going to move on from here to our recipes.html file that we started last week. We're going to start adding some CSS to that file. So we'll see you soon.